Before we begin our first presentation, I'd like to direct your attention to the chat. We've posted a link tree in the chat where you can find our code of conduct. Following this panel, you'll also find the links to other things and panels of the day. As mentioned in the opening remarks, we're encouraging attendees to donate if they're able to the two organizations who are doing fantastic work. That includes FCJ Refugee Center and Justice for Migrant Workers. So our first panelist, Maxine Both, is a Guy Drummond Fellow and MA candidate in Political Science and International Development Studies at McGill University. Her presentation, Understanding Resistance to Immigration Control, Case of Immigration Detention in Laval, Quebec, Canada, rethinks migrants as agents of change and poses specific questions for consideration, including how can projects of immigration control be resisted, as well as the dynamics of political agency in these acts of resistance. It's my pleasure to introduce her, and I'd like to hand the floor over to her so that she can begin.
Thank you so much, Anusha, for that introduction. So I'm just going to share my screen. I'm not sure if it's possible.
Anusha, you may have to do that because I don't seem to be able to have ability to make co-host.
Yes, so Maxine, I'll make you co-host and then you can share your screen. So
great, thanks.
okay, please go ahead and share your presentation.
Okay, perfect. Is that clear for everyone? Okay, so thank you all. I'm really excited to be here today. It's a great conference. So I'm going to be explaining my research, and this is actually part of a larger master's thesis project. So due to time constraints, I'm only going to be presenting one of my three theories, so the work of James C. Scott, but the larger project actually explores the application of the work of Hannah Arendt on rightlessness and political agency, and Michel Foucault on governmentality and counterconducts. And I'm happy to explain those in more detail in the questions, but I'm just going to be focusing on the one theory today. So I'm particularly interested in understanding resistance to immigration control and looking at the case of immigration detention in Laval, Quebec. So in a growing context of mass displacement and the increasing salience of borders, the nation state and immigration control, or gatekeeping, this creates, migrants are often seen not only as threats to the nation state, but also as victims or beneficiaries, unable to create change as depoliticized and passive victims. As states turn away from their responsibilities to offer protection and assistance, and as humanitarian organizations often become overburdened, this leaves a gap of precarity for many migrants subject to structures of immigration control, such as detention, deportation, and dispersal. Moreover, when we think about the literature on collective action or social movement studies, migrants within immigration detention might be theorized as too constrained to act due to structural constraints posed by resource mobilization or political opportunities. And in this sense, this understanding leaves little room for theorizing about individual, small-scale, and sub-state acts and actors, which may fly under the radar and may not be as successful in their goals. For instance, migrants themselves may carry out active strategies to resist within constrained circumstances, or citizens in the host country may work alongside in solidarity. I therefore argue that within the structural constraints posed by immigration detention and control practices, migrants should be seen as political agents engaging in what I call a continuum of acts of resistance in solidarity with non-migrants, and these range in form, scale, and intensity. And these solidarity movements extend across territorial-based citizenship lines of identity, and therefore may offer new understandings of traditional boundaries of the state, citizenship, and its borders. So just a few definitions. So I define migrant as an all-encompassing term ranging in experiences from more permanent to more temporary forms of displacement. So this would include convention status refugees, asylum seekers, precarious migrants, or those who have achieved citizenship and have been living in the country for quite some time. And this I compare to the non-migrant with no experience of displacement, usually born within the host country in which they reside. Second, this term of agency. So often agency is theorized in relation to migrants in terms of Hannah Arendt's work on rightlessness, where they are sort of outside of the political community and unable to exert their political agency as a result. In this sense, I see migrant solidarity organizations acting in important ways to form sort of bridges over this divide through mediation between migrants and non-migrants in the context of immigration detention. However, rather than seeing agency as sort of dependent on these dynamics of solidarity, it's important to consider agency through action. So drawing on the works of acts of citizenship literature, which asserts agency through the act itself, irrespective of identity. So in this sense, I interpret solidarity as working alongside migrants in collaboration, rather than continuing this provider-beneficiary dynamic. Although it's important to acknowledge that power dynamics are ever present for those in precarious situations and those working alongside. So my research centers on three main research questions. The first is, how are projects of immigration control, specifically immigration detention, resisted? And here I attempt to answer this research question by explaining that resistance by migrants and non-migrants in solidarity is expressed in diverse ways, so varying in form, scale, and intensity. Second, what dynamics of political agency do these acts of resistance show? So here, the migrant is seen as a political agent, but operating within significant structural constraints, which are also mediated by non-migrants in solidarity. And here, solidarity is understood as resistance as not necessarily being contingent on citizenship, and therefore reconfiguring our understandings of political agency for migrants. And thirdly, which theoretical framework can be most helpful for understanding this form of resistance? Here I bring in the work of James C. Scott in his ideas of everyday versus publicly declared resistance. And this reconfigures mainstream ideas of resistance. So I place into conversation his ideas with my own work to show resistance sort of along a continuum ranging in different scales. So just a brief overview of Scott's work. So I chose his theory because he's well placed to theorize the marginalized. He carries out ethnographic research of peasant farming communities in Malaysia. So he looks at sort of the struggle between the peasantry and the higher class. So therefore, his work is useful to extend to those excluded from traditional political channels or situated within complex power structures, as migrants usually are. Then he comes up with this term, sort of weapons of the weak, or these two categorizations. So on one side, we have the everyday forms of peasant resistance between the peasantry and the higher class. And this strategy of resistance undermines power structures, but they remain hidden in their identity through the use of what he terms hidden transcripts or critique of power spoken behind the dominant. In contrast, he has this idea of publicly declared resistance. So this is much more organized, direct, and commonly aims to disrupt the dominant order in an open confrontation and requires recognition of these gains. So in this sense, everyday forms require little or no coordination. They're sort of more self-help form, and they don't have this direct confrontation with authority. So in my project, what I really want to engage in is sort of placing into conversation his two categories of resistance and sort of seeing if this holds, I would say. So I want to sort of critique his binary categorization. So rather look at resistance along a continuum where both forms are merely endpoints on this continuum. And this here I'm drawing from the work from Brooke and Johansson and Windhagen, where they highlight that often these forms are hybrid, they mix and combine in new ways. However, by having both ends defined, this allows for inclusion of a variety of acts and a comparison of empirical reality with his categorization. And especially in political science alone, often the focus tends to go towards these public acts, and I want to show the importance of considering both forms. And also, I should note that much of migrant solidarity resistance is often about making things explicit and public. For example, what their bodies are doing, where they're placing them in space or legal designation, or who collaborates with them. However, on another way, they're also small scale and limited, maybe limited in their impact. So Scott might offer some insights into both sort of forms occurring. So in terms of my methods, I carried out 8 months of research using a multi-method qualitative approach, infused a lot with ethnographic approaches. So I used participant observation with 5 different migrant solidarity groups in and around Montreal. I attended several public events held by these groups, such as film screenings, information sessions, outreach programs, annual celebrations, and lobbying. And this was both in person and online, as the COVID pandemic did affect the research. Second, semi-structured interviews with activists from these groups, so migrants and non-migrants, with varying levels of embeddedness, and this was held via Zoom. And then third, discourse analysis. So this was grounded in an analysis of publicly available documents from these groups, so news articles, websites, social media posts, public submissions to government institutions, flyers, or handbooks. So the other aspect was sort of this grounded in a case study. So often Canada is praised for its responses to some of the most prominent refugee crises of our history. We think of the Syrian refugee crisis, often gets a lot of credit for Canadian society. However, I wish to argue that Canada is not an exception to policies of immigration control and detention occurring worldwide. Moreover, when we look at the literature, there's a lot of literature on migrant-led acts, less on solidarity, which actually can be extremely important for improved policy towards migrant integration. So this is where the case study took place. So there's the construction of a new immigration detention center in Laval, so outside of Montreal, set to be built in 2021, so this year. And this acted as a case study in being sort of symbolic of the broader concerns with immigration detention and control in Canada and the resistance it engenders. So there was a network of local community solidarity organizations resisting at various levels and in various ways. So the different strategies they engaged in were detention visits, protests, sit-ins, popular education, networks, lobbying, blockades, acts of sabotage as well. And this really demonstrated the aspect of resistance on a continuum. So we can see here for one of the activists, she said, for me, it's very simple things, the revolution, we do it every day. So this idea of doing very small acts compared to more public acts. So this would be in contrast to Scott, where many of these acts were explicitly made public. So we can see solidarity across borders in the discourse. They reject the Canadian state's borders and deportation. And then we also have this idea of sort of resisting within significant constraints and the cumulative change that this actually creates. So for Jenny from Action Réfugiés Montréal, she said, maybe the successes have been not making things worse as opposed to making things better. So often the fear and mistrust created by government control in the context of immigration detention discouraged resistance, especially for migrants. However, these organizations were central in creating a safe space to speak out and collaborate with migrants in resistance. In addition, there was a lot of discussion in terms of sort of resistance stemming from the intention of these acts rather than the outcome. So often many of these goals would not be achieved. However, they were nonetheless important to these migrant solidarity organizations. And then lastly, there was also a difference between sort of radical versus reformist goals. So some were in direct confrontation with the state. For example, anarchist groups, their discourse emphasizes, may fires burn for all that the worlds of prison and borders have stolen from us. And then we had more reformist organizations, which were more focused on sort of change within the constraints. So key takeaways, my research hoped to demonstrate the political agency of migrants. They're not too constrained to act, rather they're acting within significant constraints. Second, resistance needs to be seen on a continuum as legitimate regardless of intensity, scale, place, or outcome. And third, solidarity can challenge notions of territorial-based citizenship and eligibility for resistance, and resistance is not necessarily contingent on citizenship. In this research, I demonstrated the need to remain inclusive to active constructions of new forms of belonging, borders, and agency, and the bridge between migrants and non-migrants acting in solidarity complicated the clear divisions created by borders and its effect on political action and agency. And in terms of future research, it would be interesting to compare the Canadian case to other cases, such as the UK or Australia, which has a lot more literature on this. Also to apply alternative social movement frames to sub-state actors, which the work of Scott showed interesting insights. as well the resistance of outsiders, so more work on sort of these solidarity movements, and then also looking at resistance irrespective of outcome. So that's all I have for now, but I'm looking forward to the questions as well as the other presentations. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Maxine. Before we move on to our second panelist, I'd like to remind the attendees to please save your questions until our discussion period. You can post them in the chat at that point.
Anusha, I think you muted yourself.
Apologies, I seem to have been talking the entire time while I was muted. Thank you, Maxine, for the wonderful presentation. I'd like to remind you to please save your questions until the discussion period. They can be posted in the chat. It's now my pleasure to introduce our second panelist, Catherine Crooke. She's a PhD sociology student at the University of California, Los Angeles, who also holds a JD from Yale Law School and an MSc in Refugee and Forced Migration Studies from the University of Oxford. Her presentation, The Temporal Tensions of Asylum Lawyering, examines the temporal dynamics of the US asylum system from the viewpoint of Los Angeles-based asylum lawyers through the use of ethnographic fieldwork while drawing together literature on the temporal of asylum procedure and the politicization of time. Catherine, please begin whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you so much. And good morning, everyone. It's quite early here, so apologies if my voice is a little croaky. So I actually wanted to experiment today with doing a presentation without a PowerPoint, which it's the first time I've done this, maybe the last time, because I think the last presentation was really excellent and I'm missing the visuals. But hopefully I'll be engaging enough that you'll be able to follow along even without sort of the slides. So my research is focused on asylum lawyering in Los Angeles, as was mentioned. And the question that really kind of, I guess this came from me out of the awareness that in the US, lawyers really matter tremendously for the outcomes of asylum cases and kind of for the well-being of asylum seekers more broadly. And so obviously, there's been a tremendous amount of intense immigration control policies, particularly under the Trump administration, that's really escalated. And we've seen a range of things, including more visible policies, such as the migrant protection protocols here, which keep folks completely trapped at the border, unable to even gain entry in order to make an asylum claim, but also much more subtle kind of smaller, less visible changes that kind of have a more bureaucratic cumulative effect to make it really difficult for people to access protection. And so given the sort of technical nature and the legal nature of all of those changes, I'm interested in how that reality trickles down into the experience of asylum lawyers and how it impacts their work and ultimately transforms the way that they go about doing their work here, and particularly in this region. So the core questions that I'm trying to answer through my project, and similarly to Maxine, this is part of my MA research, are how the technologies of state immigration control manifest in the daily work of asylum lawyers. And then second, how must lawyers adapt their practices to respond to shifting state policy? So a different way of putting that is, how do these migration control mechanisms actually transform the way that asylum lawyers are operating on the ground? And I apologize, I'm looking down here because I have my notes on the side. So the way that I'm answering this question is through ethnography. I am happy to talk more about this during our kind of Q&A session, because we don't have much time here, but it's certainly been a journey given the pandemic. I was fortunate in that I was able to start my field work last February, kind of early in the year. And so I did have a couple of months working in person with my participants. And so I'm based at a small legal aid nonprofit organization that really orients all of its work towards assisting asylum seekers both folks who are based in Los Angeles and around the LA area, but also people who are south at the border and kind of trapped in Mexico. I have a legal background, and so I was able to gain access to the organization as a legal volunteer. And I assist attorneys at my field site with sort of the basic day-to-day work that they're doing on their client representation. And so that's really allowed me to see, to track the sort of rhythms of how their work unfolds and to really see just what the daily dynamics are like of their work. Of course, when coronavirus hit and we kind of went into shelter in place last March, I had to adapt my approach. And so I was, again, very lucky in that most of the work that I'm doing is able to occur digitally and remotely. And so I've been able to continue doing that and have been working to do remote observations, which is challenging, but doable, I've found. I would say that the kind of biggest impact of COVID was that I came into the project expecting to focus more on the spatial dynamics of different migration policies. So in particular, how attorneys have to adapt their work to access folks who are in detention, for example, or folks who are at the border. And those spatial dynamics have simply just been a little bit harder to observe given the reality of not being able to leave my home. But the silver lining here was that what that did kind of bring to the fore, working under these conditions, I really became much more aware of the temporal dynamics that were at play and how those were impacting the work of asylum lawyers. So in that line, I'm kind of building on the work of international migration scholars who have called for a deeper focus, not just on the space of international migration, but the temporal dimensions of it, how time operates. And a lot of that research so far has focused on the different kind of modes of time from the perspective of migrants themselves. And so here I'm trying to bring that to bear a little bit more from the vantage point of advocates and the people who are working alongside or on behalf of people who are seeking asylum. I'm also trying to draw from the literature that's on cause lawyering. And so thinking about how this reality sort of transforms asylum lawyering as a type of cause lawyering or public interest lawyering. So there's quite a lot of literature on that. So with the time I have left, I think I'll just kind of quickly talk through some of the key takeaways, and there definitely isn't time to go into everything that I'm trying to point out in this paper. But the core argument is that asylum lawyers are contending with a type of temporal violence in the work that they do here that cuts in two directions. And so on the one hand, we have them experiencing a sort of weaponized efficiency that the state leverages to make it more difficult for people to access protection. And on the other hand, the state also mobilizes weaponized inefficiency to make it difficult for people to gain access to asylum. And so attorneys have to really navigate both of those two sides of the same coin, in a sense, in their work and adapt their practices to accommodate both of them. So I give a few examples of each of these in the paper. I'll just focus on one each here. So in terms of weaponized efficiency, I think it's a little bit easier to see the ways that lawyers can adapt and can try to push back and resist state policy. One compelling example here was just over the course of the past year, the Trump administration was using regulations to try to overhaul fairly established, very well established norms of asylum and protection in the US. And so they would kind of go through a process where they would draft a rule that really undermined many years of pro-immigrant advocacy. And then they present that rule to the public, and there's a 30-day comment period where people have the opportunity to offer feedback, suggestions, comments on the proposed changes before the government actually finalizes the rule and puts it into effect. And the government is required to go through each of the comments that they receive from the public during that period. And so this is an example of the government sort of making an enormous sweeping change over the course, it would take effect within a few months or even weeks. And so really undoing a lot of well-established law very quickly. But the way that lawyers tried to resist this was really by slowing down the speed with which this could take effect. And so I think a lot of the fieldwork I'm doing affirms the idea, the metaphor of the US immigration system as a machine, which, is just kind of barreling forward with a lot of forward momentum. And so the tactic here that lawyers take is to try to effectively, through kind of individual action, slow down the gears of that machine. And so in this case, it was specifically the lawyers at my field site joining up with lawyers all around the country to effectively crowdsource as many people as possible, whether they were lawyers or just members of the public, to write comments complaining about the rule, and to basically create an enormous volume of comments that the government would then have to go through one by one before they could actually implement the law and the legal change. And so it was fascinating to see. There were kind of a lot of creative efforts to think about how people could slow this down even more. If we do handwritten comments, will that be more difficult and slow the officials down because you have to kind of scan it in before they can really assess it. Just a lot of effort to figure out how to counterbalance this kind of sheer magnitude and force that the government has. On the other hand, we have weaponized inefficiency. And I think here it's a little bit more difficult, or you see that there's more constraints in terms of the tools that lawyers have to actually resist when the government uses standstill and even, just really stagnation to make it difficult for people to access asylum. And I think maybe an extreme example of this is just the government's manipulation of backlogs in the system. And this is compelling because often here we talk about, there's this kind of myth that immigrants use backlogs to game the system and to basically kind of pretend that they're asylum seekers and enjoy the luxuries of living in the US in the meantime while they await a decision. And in fact, what my fieldwork is showing is that the government is leveraging these backlogs and sort of taking advantage of this idea that there's so many people in the system that they really have to slow everything down because we can't process this many people. And this really transforms the work that lawyers can do, because in many cases it means that they simply can't do the function that they're there for. And instead they sort of pivot to other less legal models of assistance or less legal models of support for their clients. And so I think this actually speaks to sort of this question of solidarity. What I see is a lot more non-legal forms of accompaniment, of figuring out how to bear witness, how to be with, how to endure this unending passage of time, this unending waiting period alongside clients. And that really transforms what asylum lawyering looks like and what its purported objectives are. So I'll just close with kind of highlighting a few consequences of this, and I've kind of gestured towards some of these already. So first is kind of this reconfiguration of what the cause is of asylum lawyering. What is it that's driving asylum lawyers and that theoretically motivates the work that they're doing? And I think what we're seeing overall is a shift from a drive that's oriented towards substance, towards kind of who is a refugee, who deserves protection, how do we expand the scope of who counts and get more people in, to a practice that's much more driven by procedure, and that's focused on deadlines and timelines and the logistics of actually gaining access to protection. And I think also, as I sort of mentioned already, we see this fracturing of attorneys' identity, where they're becoming a little bit disconnected from some of the legal work that they do, and they have to reinvent themselves in a sense as being in solidarity with their clients in a different way. I think similarly, they're also changing their relationship to the state is changing. So we have on the one hand, this continued resistance and a stark contrast between the state and its actions and lawyers' objectives. In a sense, they're sort of subjected to this temporal violence alongside their clients. And I think that creates more of a parallel and a kinship between clients and attorneys. But at the same time, the way that the state manipulates time is so totalizing that in some ways it sort of forces lawyers to enact the same violence on their clients, because they're to some extent the enforcers. They have to play by these same rules. And so I think that there's almost a complicity that's required of attorneys, which creates a lot of tension for them. And then finally, I'll just end with one that I think is maybe pretty obvious, but I think is worth further exploration, and that's just the sort of human harms to asylum lawyers. There's just huge cost to lawyers' well-being in terms of the stress of this, the fatigue, the sense of hopelessness and futility. And I think this really warrants more attention. And I'll just kind of end by going back to the point that lawyers really matter in the US context for the success, at least the legal success of claims and whether people are able to gain access to protection. And so the state's ability to erode their well-being through these practices really has huge implications for the effectiveness of our protection systems. I'll stop there. Thank you guys so much, and looking forward to hearing other presentations.
Thank you, Catherine, for your insightful presentation into the practice of asylum lawyering and addressing some of the barriers which lawyers face in establishing solidarity with their clients, as well as your use of ethnographic fieldwork. I look forward to discussing that more in the discussion. It's now my pleasure to introduce our third panelist, Salma Refaei. Salma is a PhD student at Carleton University's Department of Political Science, specializing in gender and diversity studies and international relations, who also holds an MA in political science from the University of British Columbia and a BA in political science and history from the American University in Cairo, Egypt. Her presentation, Agency as a Negative Space, Between UNHCR Agency Mainstreaming and Refugees' Refusal, poses a twofold inquiry where she examines the conceptualization of agency adopted by the UNHCR and conducts an investigation of the factors which shape this conceptualization. Salma, whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thanks a lot, Anusha. If it's possible to share a screen, that would be awesome. If not, no worries. I think I should be okay.
Yes, certainly. I'll let you go ahead and do that.
Thank you.
Please go ahead and share your presentation, Salma.
Thanks, Anusha. I hope that everyone can view that. Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you. Thanks, Anusha, and thanks everyone for making time to be here today and for making this possible. I'm really excited to be sharing this with you. So like Anusha said, in this paper, I predominantly focus on a refugee agency from an institutional perspective or through an examination of institutional pathologies. And I situate my project within a conversation in forced migration literature on agency to discuss it through the logics of binaries. And I think this is something that Maxine brilliantly discussed earlier. So in the past 2 decades, there has been, sorry, I just need to figure out how to, okay, here we are, sorry. So in the past 2 decades, there has been a disciplinary turn that urges scholars, forced migration scholars or scholars working on refugee studies to unsettle the conceptual dichotomy that frames refugee subjects as either helpless and rightless in Arendtian terms, or as fully free actors. Instead, this turn encouraged scholars to engage with refugees as code technical agents who are engaged in the difficult task of social navigation, end quote. This new turn presents agency as a range of realizable possibilities, urging scholars to move beyond the question of agency as a matter of something that either refugees have or do not have. And this turn does a lot of things for the discipline, but it predominantly helps us understand agency as something that is necessary and as an inseparable dimension of refugee subjectivity, highlighting the critical need to study agency and acknowledging the multidimensionality of the refugee subject. Now, this turn to incorporate agency was not exclusive to the field of forced migration, so it was not just an academic turn, but it also manifested itself through a major policy shift within international organizations, particularly within UNHCR as the organization that the global refugee regime mandated to represent refugees, protect them, and ensure their well-being. In the recent years, UNHCR started to redesign their mandates to recognize and listen to what they would frame as refugee voices, which was definitely promising, and it was the right step in the right direction. However, that turn remained unfinished because it only signified what I'll continue to refer to in this paper or in this presentation as agency mainstreaming, which promises a level of inclusion, but it's an inclusion that it can also be subliminally silencing, constraining, and patriarchal. And the reason I focus on agency here is that I find it epistemologically problematic that it remains under-examined in the field. So agency, as understood in this paper, is a foundational concept for understanding how refugees mitigate risks and how they tactically and strategically navigate their everyday life within and without the global refugee regime. And accordingly, dismissing agency in refugee research and failing to conceptualize it critically or engage with it is likely to result in a partial narrative and ultimately a partial policy perpetuating the inequalities and the power asymmetries that research is often trying to reverse or problematize. However, again, the debate I present here is way beyond whether refugees have agency or not, because they most certainly do, or whether UNHCR has to incorporate agency or not, because UNHCR does acknowledge agency. The problem that this project is predominantly concerned with here is this kind of approach, or what kind of approach, I should say, that UNHCR uses to incorporate agency in its agenda setting. And from that, I turn to the research question. So this paper tries or attempts to answer the question, what are some of the factors that inform and shape UNHCR's conceptualization of refugee agency? And the question posits a twofold inquiry. The first one is a question that explores the multiple conceptualizations that UNHCR has for agency. And the second part of the question is an investigation of some of the factors that shape these conceptualizations. In response to the first inquiry, the paper argues that UNHCR conceptualizes agency as static, positive, and is directly aligned with its visions and interests. This particular understanding of agency overlooks negative agency, such as this performed in acts of vulnerability that do not culminate in efforts towards peace building as understood and envisioned by UNHCR. Secondly, the paper locates and focuses on two factors that shape UNHCR's current understanding of agency, which are the centrality of durable solutions and peace building, particularly during emergencies, and state and institutional interests. In response to the question, the paper argues that influenced by the state and its institutional interest and constrained by its commitment to durable solutions, UNHCR selectively engages in agency mainstreaming where it celebrates and acknowledges positive expressions of agency that are aligned with its interest and simultaneously silences and strategically silences negative expressions of agency that are counterproductive to its peace-building efforts. In terms of the approach that I use, I turn to an analytical approach where I use particularly secondary literature to locate and identify UNHCR's conceptualization of agency, and I rely on most up-to-date critiques in the field of UNHCR's incorporation of agency in its work. And I do so because I partly wanted to emphasize that the second part of the project or the question is the core question that I'm trying to uncover. I didn't use one geographical case study, nor did I want to constrain or do a disservice to other case studies that could potentially be useful. And since it's a macro level analysis where I look at the topic through an institutional lens, I wanted to keep an open sort of approach to different examples, and this is what I do. I still use the institutional case study, and that is UNHCR, because one of the findings that this research later uncovered is that different institutions have different interests. And so by analyzing like UNHCR's conceptualization of agency turned out to be quite different than what IOM, for instance, has. And so the reason I predominantly focus on UNHCR is that it's the institution that the regime delegated representational authority to, which makes its conceptualization quite dominant. Now back to the questions and findings. So this is an investigation of first UNHCR's conceptualization of agency, and then second, the factors that shape this. For the first part of the question, research showed that UNHCR does not have one conceptualization of agency, but that it predominantly prioritizes positive agency over negative. So positive agency is contextual, but it basically entails any acts that work with and support the peace program. So if the peace program requires refugee participation through elections, education, health programs, economic revitalization, and either remaining patiently in the camps or the settlements, or repatriating at a particular time that is determined by UNHCR and the host or the donor state, then this will be understood and conceptualized as positive agency that will be acknowledged and celebrated as refugee voices. Negative agency, on the other hand, is any expression of agency that is counterproductive to the peace program. So these are basically expressions of vulnerability and refusal. If refugees refuse to work with the peace program, if they refuse to support it, if they refuse to repatriate when they're instructed to, or if they choose to stay at a particular place without UNHCR's approval, if they contest refugee identity or question the status, then all of these acts will likely be silenced and dismissed for strategic purposes. Now, an example to negative agency and refusal would be Mariam Al-Khawli's story as engaged with or narrated in Tiffany Page's piece in Feminist Review. So on March 25th, 2014, Al-Khawli, who's a Syrian refugee woman, visited UNHCR's office in Tripoli in Lebanon to reinstate her food assistance, something that she and her family have been sustainably receiving for a year and a half and were suddenly denied. After several futile attempts to understand why is it that she stopped receiving the assistance, she opened her bag, picked a small bottle of diesel, poured it on her clothes, and set herself on fire. She was rushed to the hospital by UN guards and other bystanders, where she spent a month there before she passed away as a result of her second and third degree burns. Now, Al-Khawli's partaking in self-immolation as an expression of refusal, helplessness, and vulnerability encapsulates the core of refugee agency as conflated, ambivalent, and contradictory. And this refusal that the UNHCR has strategically for an incorporation of such level of performance of agency is something worth stopping at. Because Al-Khawli was an ideal refugee. When she was living on assistance, when she remained in Tripoli for that year and a half, when she engaged with the peace program as UNHCR envisioned it, and once she engaged in something that UNHCR did not necessarily approve of, this is where her agency was kind of stripped away from her, and she was labeled more as a victim as opposed to someone who just performed her right of being. Now, there are several reasons behind UNHCR refusal. So when I started this, I remember I had like a list of 5 factors, but when I was writing, I realized that to explore each factor elaborately, I had to focus on the 2 most significant shapers according to the literature. So my findings showed that UNHCR is predominantly influenced by its institutional interests. And those shape how it navigates part and state interests, and that it's constrained by its commitment to durable solutions. So in their commitment to durable solutions, UNHCR promises, quote, the planned resolution of large-scale, protracted forms of displacement that require the participation and coordination of vast numbers of individuals, institutions, and agencies, end quote. And this is an expensive project that requires large-scale cooperation and a securing of something that is known in the literature as shared agency, as well as the dedication of communities' resources and time. However, This genuine commitment to durable solutions often comes at the expense of a full conceptualization of refugee agency as conflated, ambivalent, and contradictory. As durable solutions institute master plans, coordinating body, they require by principle a level of homogeneity and a shared agency and a collective commitment to peace building program in effect. And as a result of its pursuit of this homogeneous shared commitment to peace building program as part of the durable solution, UNHCR is likely to tactically silence performances of agencies such as al-Khawlis that threaten the stability and the order and the homogeneity of the peace of the positive agency supporting implementation of the durable solutions. And this really begs the question, who are durable solutions then for? Research showed that durable solutions are not born in vacuum. Gil Loescher argues that, quote, UNHCR policy and practice have been driven both by state interests and by the office, end quote. Loescher speaks to Barnett and Finnemore's work on institutional pathologies and highlight UNHCR's institutional autonomy and how it, influenced by its very own pathologies, maximizes on its productive power to navigate state interests to meet its own. So UNHCR basically prioritizes and strives to maintain its institutional relevance, autonomy, and survival. It navigates state interests to guarantee its own survival as an institution. It invests in durable solutions, as explained above, to maintain its political relevance within the global refugee regime. And it invests in both relevance and survival to maintain its own institutional autonomy. This then explains why is it that UNHCR doesn't feature voices that are counterproductive to its interest. Now, wrapping up, this argument has several implications. For the field of forced migration, this paper calls for the engagement with agency as a complex, multi-layered concept and lived experience. The paper also suggests that looking into contradictions and tension within individual expressions of agency, because vulnerable expressions might be perceived as negative, but if they align with state interest, then sometimes they are likely to then be co-opted and acknowledged by UNHCR. Now, in terms of practice and policy, the paper attempted to locate a gap in UNHCR agency mainstreaming and quest for the inclusion of refugees in the design and implementation of durable solutions. It attempted to highlight particular expressions of agency that are unlikely to be acknowledged because they are perceived as negative unless they offer something of value to either UNHCR's durable solutions or institutional interests. It also located some of the causes of this selectivity so that they could be addressed more critically. It offers a potential guide on where and how to reform UNHCR agency mainstreaming policy to capture all voices and all expressions of agency. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to discuss this more with you in the Q&A and listen to more presentations as we go on. Thanks, Anusha.
Thank you, Salma, for your insightful presentation and discussing agency as conceptualized by the UNHCR, as well as the factors that shape this. We're almost at the end of our panel. So to the attendees, please post any questions you have in the chat and they will be addressed in the discussion. It's now my pleasure to introduce our final, but certainly not least, panelist Sarah Marshall. Sarah is in her 4th year of pursuing a PhD in sociology, and her research interests are in the areas of migration, precarity, and health. Her presentation, Who Deserves Healthcare? Investigating Healthcare Workers' Perceptions and Practices Towards Non-Status Persons, considers how healthcare workers and non-status people interact within institutional networks and the barriers faced by non-status persons in accessing many social rights and entitlements. Sarah, I'll hand it over to you so that you can share your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Anusha. It's been so great to be here so far, and I've really enjoyed all of the presentations. So today I'm going to be presenting on some of my early dissertation work, and because it's in its early stages, I would really appreciate any comments or feedback or questions that people may have for me. Let me pull up my PowerPoint if I'm able to here. And just give me 1 second. Okay. I have to bring my shared thing to the front. Does that look okay? Can you see my screen and everything? Okay, cool. All right, so today I'm going to be presenting on who deserves healthcare, exploring social interactions and negotiations between healthcare workers and precarious status persons. So my research looks at the ways that discourses of health deservingness are understood, practiced, negotiated, and contested across multiple actors and healthcare institutions. And I have two central aims. Firstly, I've been looking at finding out how discourses of deservingness can shape the practices of healthcare workers. And my second aim is to look at how healthcare workers and precarious status persons actually interact within social and institutional networks. So just a couple of definitions. By healthcare workers, I mean not only people like nurses, doctors, midwives, but also care staff and admin staff like registration clerks and admitting clerks, who also play a huge role in the sort of interactions and gatekeeping practices in healthcare institutions. Now, by precarious status persons, I am defining this as a sort of umbrella term in a category that people can fall into when they are as a sort of immigration status outside of permanent residence or citizenship status. So this can be the ways that people can fall into international student, or having a visitor visa, temporary worker status, or having what's called non-status. Okay, so in addressing my central research questions, I've tried to put them into my two research aims. So my first research aim, looking at the sort of practices and ways that discourses of deservingness affect healthcare workers' practices, I'm trying to find out how discourses of deservingness really shape healthcare workers' perceptions, their service delivery decisions, and their care regarding precarious status persons. And secondly, I'm looking at, are these decisions applied equally to all, or are some groups and individuals seen as more deserving than others? In addressing my second research aim, looking at the sort of negotiations and contestations that occur between precarious status persons and healthcare workers, I look at how these two groups work to challenge, contest, and dismantle hierarchies of power and disparities in care through their strategies and practices. I'm also interested in finding out how practices can work to reinforce boundaries and or hierarchies of deservingness, and also likewise how the practices and the interactions can work to challenge discourses in institutional policy and everyday practice. So I'm using and borrowing from two main conceptual frameworks for this project. The first is critical border theory. So generally when borders are talked about, they're defined as these sort of static physical entities and boundaries that prevent people from entering into a nation state. With critical border theory, I'm trying to look at the ways that boundaries and bordering practices can occur not only at the edges or at the nation states, but also from within as well, and how internal bordering practices occur. This can create differential access for some. And by differential access, I mean the ways that people can actually live and reside within a specific place, but not have access to entitlements or certain services or resources that citizens or permanent residents may have. Within this critical border theory work, I'm also looking at notions of discretion and deservingness. So this being work on acts of gatekeeping, on contestation and negotiation, looking at the ways that healthcare workers advocate, how healthcare workers enact boundaries, and how precarious status persons engage in social action and try to create and negotiate pathways of access. I'm also considering what's called non-citizenship assemblages. So the work of assemblages is generally attributed to Deleuze and Guattari's work on schizophrenia, capitalism and schizophrenia. And they talk about assemblage as the ways of connecting across axes. More recently, migration and citizenship and non-citizenship scholars have used this notion of assemblages to talk about the ways that citizenship and non-citizenship can be enacted at various scales and across various actors. So I'm looking towards the work of Dr. Landolt, Dr. Goldring, and Dr. Villegas, where they discuss these sort of ways that assemblages can be applied. And how this looks is that people can sort of fall into spaces at local levels where there's these fluid relational and productive aspects of migration, of bordering, and of non-citizenship. There's all these multiplicity of social arrangements and institutional dynamics, and this can really shape the sort of interactions that occur at local levels. Okay. Now I'll discuss a little bit about the research methods that I'm using for this project. So I'm going to be using critical discourse analysis. And this really looks at the meanings, ideas, and interactions and practices that are expressed in spoken and written text in institutional and everyday settings. And how I aim to do this is to look at how discourses of deservingness are shaped by dominant power relations and how they are reproduced in institutional policies and everyday practices. So I'm going to apply a critical discourse analysis in two sort of phases. In the first phase, I will look at how they are reproduced in institutional policies by looking at archival records from 2012 to the present. And I chose 2012 just because that's when the interim federal health policy was taken away in Canada and retracted. And so it seems like a very particular and poignant moment in immigration policy history in Canada. So I will be looking at within these institutions, how their mandates look, what their reports are like, the procedures and the sort of policies that a bunch of Toronto hospitals and community health centers have. I am hoping to sort of compare and contrast across these different and various institutions to look at the ways that precarious status persons are, how their sort of entitlements and how they are, where they show up or where they don't show up in each of these spaces. Then in my second phase of research, I'm hoping to conduct approximately 45 semi-structured interviews, and I'll be looking at interviewing both healthcare workers and precarious status persons or formerly precarious status persons in and around the Toronto area. Okay, now for the remainder of my presentation, I just wanted to share some of my preliminary literature review. And I'm going to focus on looking at how ideas of health deservingness can be conceptualized, looking at how the deservingness of healthcare access is sort of played out through the discretion of healthcare workers, and then looking at the role of negotiation, contestation, and social action between various groups. So health deservingness is a sort of relational assessment of precarious status persons' social values. And this can be shaped by healthcare workers' experiences, their insights, and the organizational context that they work within. These healthcare deservingness assessments can be evaluated based on a range of factors. So it can be based on things like their perceived vulnerability or their perceived moral worth or quote unquote deservingness based on these sort of factors. It can also be related to their legal proximity to citizenship. And importantly, notions of deservingness and undeservingness are also perpetuated by discourses of illegality. So the illegalization of certain bodies and the perceived criminality that comes along with this can really shape also notions of deservingness and undeservingness. And also importantly, these categorizations are also often informed by racialized, class, and gendered biases. So I argue that health is intertwined amongst much broader issues of social equity, health equity, and social justice. So things like racism, discrimination, gendered violence, and also things like access to adequate housing or safe and secure employment. Access to healthcare services is also a heavily gendered and racialized process. And as such, precarious status persons can face interlocking forms of disadvantage. That this can relate both to their material inequality, but also how they are sort of discursively constructed. Okay. Sorry, I popped up a window here and now it's blocking my view. Okay. Got it. All right, so the role of healthcare workers is also extremely important in the ways that precarious status persons can access services. Healthcare workers can act as gatekeepers to services, where they can make their own on-the-spot assessments of deservingness, but can also be somewhat limited or restricted by formal protocols implemented by the institutions that they work within and by broader discourses like immigration and citizenship regimes. So similar to your presentation, Catherine, I think that on attorneys, I think that healthcare workers are also really limited and can be somewhat pulled in different directions. There can be a lot of tensions that go on where they simultaneously would like to act as advocates, but also do not always feel they have the space or the time to do so. So I argue that both of these, both the on-the-spot assessments and the formal protocols can really together inform the criteria for which services and care for precarious status persons is made, and also how they are, their sort of perceived eligibility and entitlement to healthcare access. Okay. Interactions between healthcare workers and precarious status persons are also extremely important in shaping precarious status persons' access to healthcare services. So healthcare workers can and do often use informal networks to connect precarious status persons with supports. And this can be things like when they don't have time on their own to provide care to a person, passing or sort of connecting them with another trusted healthcare worker that can provide support for them, or connecting the precarious status person with resources of a community health center that's in their catchment area that where they can access healthcare. Precarious status persons as well also use strategies of resistance. This can include doing things like remaining present, like getting a social insurance number, being employed in a particular position that sort of associates them or positions them in a way where they have this perceived sense of deservingness, because the ways often that we understand eligibility and perceived rights to healthcare is through our proximity to citizenship. And so this is a sort of survival strategy that precarious status persons often have to take on. They also, the connections and the solidarity and resistance movements that precarious status persons and healthcare workers engage in through informal networks, through social action and resistance, which can perpetuate and sort of build up collective acts of contestation and negotiation, can really shape trajectories of access for precarious status persons as well. And this can work to also, I argue, dismantle the restrictive boundaries of citizenship and unmake citizenship in this process. Okay, so just to wrap up some of the final thoughts, what I hope to bring out of this presentation was to look at how healthcare workers construct meanings and narratives of deservingness, how they engage in acts of bordering and border contestation, and how they practice healthcare delivery in their everyday lives. I likewise also wanted to look at how these narratives are contested through action, practice, negotiation, and actual work in daily acts that precarious status persons and healthcare workers engage in. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah, for your presentation. And thank you once again to all of our panelists. With that being said, we're now entering the Q&A period of our panel. It was great hearing from all of you. To Catherine, I had a question regarding your presentation. So you spoke a bit about the ethnographic fieldwork that you used in your research. I'd like to know a little bit more about that and what steps you used specifically in your fieldwork and the methodologies that were implemented.
Yeah, definitely. So I take a grounded approach to ethnography. That's we have a really great ethnography program here at UCLA, and that was kind of the course that, or the track that I chose within it. And so I kind of spent some time engaging a bit with theory and getting a sense of what I thought I would be interested in thematically, but really it was just a question of kind of throwing myself into the setting and then seeing what came up over the course of time. And so when I was in person, you know, I think that just looks like having a notebook with you and kind of figuring out how to be in as many interactive spaces as possible and being really attentive to what's going on and to the interactions that are taking place and how people are talking about things and what they're paying attention to. I'm really interested in trying to sort of basically I question sort of the extent to which you can have objectivity as a researcher or kind of be totally distant. So instead I would say that I move more towards trying to embrace proximity and understanding the perspective of my participants by really trying to kind of go through their experiences alongside them and getting a sense of their perspective that way so that I can represent it more accurately in my work. And then in terms of how that's shifted as I'm doing things remotely, the good thing is that a lot of, you know, all of the meetings that I was attending before are happening over Zoom. And so you lose the physicality and sort of the asides or the physical gestures that you would see if you were in person. But in a lot of ways, you're kind of able to be more attentive to sort of the actual substance of what themes are coming up, what issues are being talked about again and again. So I think in a lot of ways, what I'm seeing with remote ethnography is that text and language become much more visible than they would be otherwise, which I think there are downsides to that, and it's harder in some ways to separate digesting from analysis. I think it's easy to go into a mode of just kind of transcribing everything that's happening in a Zoom meeting because you can get away with that on your laptop. and actually trying to step back and have a bit more distance to really process the notes at a separate stage is a little bit harder to do for that reason. But in terms of kind of seeing what themes, what issues, what topics are coming up a lot and are people fixating on, that's still really easy and possible.
Thank you. Yeah, that's interesting to hear how you approached your research in that way. Maxine, we have a question in the chat for you. So this is from Ranjit Kula Tilake. Ranjit states that while for many marginalized communities, their very existence is resistance, the notion everyday acts of resistance can potentially be a cozy, comfy escape route for some who take so much space in progressive spaces. He wants to know your view on this.
Sure, yeah. I hope I'm understanding the question correctly. So do let me know if I didn't quite understand it correctly, but I think what you're getting at is maybe sort of like if everything that they do is resistance, does that sort of undermine other approaches which might be a bit more radical or focused on sort of creating much more progressive change? And I think my research, what really came through is that often agency or these resistance approaches were sort of informed a lot by the constraints that were posed. So, and I think like Catherine said, sort of often what happens is they might want to create change in a certain way, but because of the constraints that are placed by immigration control or immigration status, what happens is that the change that they do create is much more small in its nature. So I think my view on this is that we have to take into account both dynamics happening here. And then what also came up in my research, which was interesting, is that there was a lot of like a tension between different organizations, which some had a much more sort of radical approach and some were much more progressive, much more sort of reformist in their goals. And I think for the ones who were much more radical in their approach, they often sort of saw these reformist approaches as sort of a replication of the state or not really creating change. And then I think for the reformist organizations, this was really sort of, their approaches are really informed by these constraints. So for example, one of the organizations was working directly in detention centers. So they had a lot of issues surrounding sort of confidentiality, what they could say, what they couldn't say. And I think that really informed their approach and maybe made it seem more everyday in its nature. And so I think it's important to value both of those approaches and to just see them for the different factors that go into shaping them. I hope that answered your question.
Ranjit, I see that you raised your hand.
Make a point quickly?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, yeah, so my point is not to invalidate everyday resistance, but to see the ways in which it can potentially get stuck. Like for example, recycling. Individual recycling is one, can, for example, be portrayed as an everyday act of resistance, feel good. But yes, that is a good act, but at the same time, it can get into this ideology of neoliberal ideology of, okay, we do things individually and we are fine. And so we are like, it gives a feeling of comfort. But that is, this is ideology. Zizek talks about this. So that is the point, especially how neoliberal capitalist tendencies co-opt these to continue with the same ideology. That's the point I'm making. It's, of course, for so many folks, it's everyday act of resistance is so important, and their very existence is resistance. However, then some others can grab these and get into the comfortable, feel good space. That needs to be unpacked as well. That's the point I'm making.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point to make. I think sort of over theorizing everything as sort of political change could run the risk of people thinking, oh, I'm taking out my recycling, that's enough for me. But yeah, in terms of like, just speaking for the research, I didn't see too much of that happening in this case, but I think in terms of like when I was interpreting these acts, I think there was definitely, I had to sort of remind myself of the risk to sort of over theorize this and to really think about the meanings that were attributed by those carrying out the resistance, rather than maybe sort of attributing the resistance to sort of all sorts of acts. So thank you.
Thank you. So we have a question from one of our attendees, Veronica. Veronica, can you please unmute yourself so that you can ask your question?
Hi, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much all presenters for this really great ideas and presentations. It was really interesting to listen to each one of you. And so I actually have a question or comment for all of you, but so I'll start with Maxine. You might have addressed it actually now with the previous question, but I found it really interesting, this kind of, when you're talking about agency, for example, and how, especially when you were talking about radicalization, or like the difference and the tensions between kind of radical ideas and reformist views, because this is something that I'm thinking about in my work as well. Sorry, I didn't tell people I'm working in law. I'm in law and legal studies at Carleton University, doing a PhD. So, I'm just wondering how to kind of manage this tension and this mediation with the organizations or activists and the migrants themselves, because this is what I'm wondering. Just kind of like to what extent do you actually think that maybe, you know, that I'm wondering if this kind of ruins a bit the agency or the resistance of the migrants themselves, because whatever they're doing, it kind of gets channeled into one or the other direction by these activists and organizations that are well-meaning, but at the same time, it might. And I'm wondering maybe how you think that also works in terms of working within legal frameworks, because my impression is that very often human rights framework, for example, and refugee law is seen to be this liberating and helpful kind of thing. But at the same time, my impression is that very often that ends up actually de-radicalizing some of the demands and the resistance that is happening, because it puts it into this one way, that is this one framework that is set up. So that's just a comment for me for that. And for Catherine, I thought it was really interesting what you were talking about related to the lawyering, and especially lawyers resisting the system and pushing back on the state policies. And related to that, actually, I had a conversation with someone recently related to lawyers and organizations working at the US-Mexico border. So that was really interesting. And they were telling me how it seems there is a dilemma for lawyers or organizations and so on to kind of, they have to work with the system in a way, because it's what's there. It's because they want, it is the only way to kind of maybe, push through. So for example, they want to help individuals, or maybe they're looking at it more as a collective movement, but then the system is so individualized. So they have to kind of like maybe pick certain things from the policy and refugee law in order to win the case. But at the same time, maybe they also see that what they end up doing is actually just reinforcing that system that they are actually not agreeing with. So I'm just wondering if you had any comments on that. For Salma, I thought the agency mainstreaming about UNHCR was really, really interesting. I did write down some questions, but then you weren't actually answering them as you went along. So, but one thing I was just wondering if you can comment on is especially this kind of, like you were saying at the end, this tension between interests, all the kind of interests that are going into to UNHCR's mandate in terms of finances, donors, and how that kind of interacts with agency, and especially when it comes to this essentializing of refugees in order to get more funding, for example, how that kind of, I'm assuming that conflicts greatly with, that doesn't really work when very often when refugees are displaying agency, that kind of ruins that kind of picture that UNHCR wants or needs to portray. So I was just interested if you could say a little bit more about that. And how to navigate it, because I'm assuming that kind of just, places a large constraint about when it comes to being creative and finding new solutions and placing refugees in the center. And for Sarah, I guess this is not really so much of a question. I thought it was really interesting because I'm also working on these kind of categories of legalization and how that actually affects the way that we look at or how we understand the issue at hand. So it was really interesting to see how it replicates into other areas, such as health and so on. More than just legality itself. I guess one thing, because I'm not Canadian, so I'm wondering, I'm not really sure how it actually works in Canada in terms of when you're undocumented and health. So I was just wondering if you could just kind of like clarify that a bit. You might have mentioned it. So anyways, that was a long list of questions. So thank you so much, all of you.
Thank you. So we have a question from Marianne Barker. Marianne states, thanks for the presentations, panelists. I wonder if any of the panelists can comment on how agency fits within a CDA framework. I know a couple of you mentioned using CDA as a theory and/or method. How can research on immigration balance centering immigrant perspectives, voices, rights, etc., with the often structural analytical focus provided with the CDA lens? I apologize, Marianne. Before going ahead, I realized I didn't give a chance for the panelists to answer Veronica's question, so please go ahead, and then we'll be next.
Would anyone else like to respond first, or do you just want to go around? Okay, I'll just start. Yeah, mine's pretty quick. So in terms of sort of navigating the radical versus the reformist ideas, yeah, I think this tension was a bit of a surprise to me, and I didn't realize it until I engaged in interviews. And I navigated a bit in terms of sort of theory. So I interpreted a lot sort of the radical versus reformist in terms of Foucault's ideas on counterconduct. So a lot of sort of those that were more radical were more challenging the state and the borders created by the state, versus those that were more reformist would partly be seen by Foucault as sort of becoming sort of co-opted by the state and sort of listening to those immigration control structures. So in a theoretical perspective, that might be something that you could explore a bit more in terms of interpreting it. But I think those dynamics do exist and were quite strong in my research. And so it was really interesting and quite surprising for me when I did the interviews. And then in terms of mediation with activists, I think it really depends on the organization and how they sort of define solidarity. I think some of them were much better at sort of working alongside migrants, and a lot of their members are made up of migrants themselves, versus others were a bit more sort of less migrant informed. And so I think sort of it really just depends how you conceptualize agency and how you also see solidarity. And I think there's a big risk in a lot of this work to sort of create more paternalistic structures. So yeah, I would just probably explore a bit more the literature on agency and how solidarity can be defined in that sense. And thank you for your questions. These are great comments.
I also agree, Maxine. I think the way Veronica framed the question, that was really helpful. I think I was also, there were things that I didn't think about until you said them. So thanks, Veronica. I think like you're totally right about the tensions that you've talked about. And you know, if we're, what I mean, I didn't have time to talk about that, but change in the policy that UNHCR has with regards to agency is necessary. So maybe I didn't frame it that way, and I should have, because it's not working. Like even the dismissive approach is not really helping UNHCR. If you take a look at like donations, they're actually like decreasing more than ever, and it kind of feels like whatever it is that UNHCR is doing to sort of trigger people's sympathy or try to create this ideal refugee so that people would sympathize with them and ultimately make the donations is actually not working. So change or a reorientation is necessary. I think what I was just trying to do was locate the factors that are preventing this transformation or this change, because it feels like any kind of critique that I can develop without taking factor or taking into account why is it that UNHCR is resistant to this kind of change or this kind of critique would then be helpful. A different like alternative, but yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
You can just quickly jump in on the question that Veronica had. So yes, absolutely. I think that there's, especially around sort of the more substantive parts of law, there's a lot of conflict internally around the ways that that lawyers have to sort of entrench the system and just its problematic principles in order to advance the interests of their clients in the short term. And so I think that's something that people really struggle with. And I think that's also the case with some of these more procedural issues. And I'll just say, I think one thing that's going to be interesting, and this is maybe kind of a future research project, is just how that shifts as we see a new administration. So Biden is certainly no saint and it isn't kind of coming through with all of the answers and the solutions. And I think but it's interesting, obviously there's a difference between his administration and Trump's administration. And I think I'm starting to see how lawyers are having to sort of reconfigure their relationship and navigate what it looks like when you're kind of really truly in opposition and the government is like pretty explicitly the enemy versus when you have to navigate a relationship of more collaboration, but for the purposes of resolving some pretty major differences and kind of addressing issues that the government just isn't getting to and isn't addressing.
Yeah, I can quickly jump in as well, and maybe I'll speak a little bit to the critical discourse analysis. Thank you for your question, Veronica. I think that this is something that I've been working through a lot in my research, this whole structure versus agency debate. And I think that because I'm in this mindset of trying to really figure out my methods, I've been thinking through like, okay, I'm not going to do this Foucauldian discourse analysis that's really placing this emphasis on structure and on all the power relations, which are, you know, these are very important aspects, but equally as important are the ways that people resist and the ways that people contest. So I'm trying to look at other sort of critical discourse analysis and other theorists who place more emphasis on the ways that social agency and social activism is really, really important. And I think also that it's like the ways that we as researchers take into consideration our social positionality and also the ways that we are, you know, creating our research questions can really shape the sort of research that we produce. So thinking through just letting the responses speak for themselves and not putting this sort of structural emphasis on it, but letting the collective actions and the ways that people are interacting really speak for themselves, and pushing that through can be really important as well.
Thank you everyone for taking the time to answer Veronica's question. Unfortunately, we're nearing the break, which is scheduled until 12:30. So if it's all right with all of you, I'll just let the panelists answer Marianne's question. And to Catherine, there's 2 questions for you in the chat posed by Sean Rahag and Brianna. So the first question posed by Sean is with respect to your use of ethnographic in your research project, and he asks if you have considered how different types of lawyers may be affected in their lawyering when addressing these sort of concerns. You can find that in the chat. Similarly, Brianna also asks if there's a unique aspect in addressing this. So if you'd like, while Marianne's question is being answered, you can take time to address those in the chat as well.
Perfect, will do.
So I can answer Marianne's question on the critical discourse analysis framework. So I sort of complemented critical discourse analysis with interviews and participant observation. And I found this a very helpful method because I think often when you do sort of one or the other, you tend to lose sight of different things. So I think the interviews were sort of very important for highlighting like individual experience and also sort of diversity within an organization, because in these migrant solidarity organizations, there's a lot of sort of different experiences, different hierarchy within them. And so I think I used discourse analysis to sort of maintain my focus on sort of the broader organizational goals. So sometimes that can be helpful in terms of analyzing the discourse of maybe like an organization, what they are saying on sort of their social media, what they're publishing, compared to maybe interviews, which give a much more sort of individual, personal side to the story. So I think for balancing, I would say it's sometimes good to balance with like another method, and to sort of think about sort of what the discourse is saying, where it's coming from, and what it means.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maxine. Is there any other panelists who would like to answer that question?
I think Sarah also kind of touched on it in addressing Veronica's question. So yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you guys both.
Hey, thank you very much, everyone, our panelists, and for the attendees attending our conference. As of right now, there is a scheduled break until 12:30 in the program. As noted in the opening remarks of today's conference, there's a link tree that you'll find if you've registered on Eventbrite, so you can look to that to view the code of conduct. Depending on what panel you've registered for next, that will show up and become available closer to 12:30. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.